And welcome back to the Infowars Nightly News. I'm Jon Bowne, your host tonight. We are going to speak with Joe Plummer, who has written a book called Dishonest Money, Financing the Road to Ruin. And what Joe has done for us he's taken the monumental task of taking G. Edward Griffin's The Creature from Jekyll Island and, of course, a lot of other information and breaking it down for the common person to understand why we're in the situation we're in and the intricacies involved with the criminal activity that was born of the Federal Reserve. And, of course, you can find this book at the Infowars store. It, again, is Dishonest Money. And now we go to Joseph Plummer. And, Joseph, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, John.
And I just want to start off with a quote here, basically from your Obi-Wan Kenobi. G. Edward Griffin says of Dishonest Money, an excellent job of condensing a large and complicated topic. And that's saying something there, because G. Edward has written this epic book, and each chapter in itself seems to be a book in itself. But you've taken that and condensed it down for people so that it's easy to read, easy for them to understand and recognize within our system the criminality that we're experiencing and have been experiencing for decades.
Yeah, I was pretty happy to get that recommendation, because there really isn't anybody else I can think of who I would rather have an endorsement from than Ed Griffin. When I started looking into the Federal Reserve System back in 2003, everything I found was just needlessly convoluted and seemed intentionally vague, and there was a bunch of different conflicting information, and just depending on who you were, whose opinion you were taking, there were just all these different arguments. And it wasn't until a couple years of going through the books written by economists, which is just nothing but economies. If you're familiar with legalese, lawyers, imagine economies. It's the same basic concept. I finally came across The Creature from Jekyll Island a couple years later in 2005. And it was just like, oh my God, this is fantastic. This is great. Somebody actually took their time, tried to break it all down, presented only relevant information, pointed out the most important stuff. And at that point, I was really excited, because I had a good understanding by then, but I didn't have anything that I could actually give to people. And I was really happy, because I was like, okay, anybody can understand this. Well, the thing that I didn't take into account is, yeah, anybody can understand it, but unfortunately, most people aren't too excited about reading a 600-page book. And so that was really upsetting for me, because the information in the book is so important, but I couldn't seem to convince very many people that they needed to read it. So essentially what I did is I took the same story. It is the same story. There are numerous books on it. It's told a bunch of different ways. But I basically took the same story, the story of the Federal Reserve System, the story of the people who are using that system against us, using control of the money supply to corrupt our institutions and every other horribly evil thing that they're doing, and put it into a form that nobody would be intimidated by. And then throughout the book, I encourage people, because I think this was a big part of it. It's, if somebody doesn't know anything about a particular topic, they're already a little bit apprehensive to approach it. If it's a topic that is notoriously difficult to understand, as is the monetary system, it's worse. And then if you add into that, it's a 600-page book, it just is another obstacle. So basically what I wanted to do is prove that the topic does not need to be intimidating, that it isn't that difficult to understand, and condense it down into something that anybody wouldn't be intimidated by. This is a one-day book. You can read it in 5 hours if you were to sit down and read it.
Yeah, and it seems, reading G. Edwards' book, and I have to be honest, I didn't get to the end. It's huge. I'm still reading it. But you do read it, and you come up with a conclusion that, well, the first conclusion is, I got to get this out to people I know. How do we not know this? How has this been kept secret all this time? And then you gradually start to think, well, this is what should be taught about American history. I think your book, if we win this thing, you know what I mean? Your book will be used in public schools and, all over the world.
Well, I really, truly, simply wanted to write something that could reach all those other people. Like I said, I just wanted to give them something that they could easily open, they could easily understand, they wouldn't be intimidated by, because it's so incredibly important for people to understand this. And then if they're looking for, you know, just the epitome of the story, as I recommend in my book, then go to Ed Griffin's. But at the very least, gain this general understanding, because if you have a general understanding of what they're doing, it's going to make it a lot more difficult for them to continue what they're doing. In fact, eventually, as people gain awareness, it's going to make it impossible for them to continue doing what they're doing.
Sure, and I'm sure there are a lot of people out there, although our listeners are pretty savvy on this topic, but there are a few people out there saying, well, come on, guys, what are you talking about? You know, what kind of secret information are you talking about? Well, here in America, we're talking about the meeting that took place on Jekyll Island in Georgia and was done by an elite group of bankers and Senator Aldrich, who was the father-in-law of J.D. Rockefeller, yeah. And then they used code names in order that the information didn't get out. And the story in itself of how the income tax was created, how the Federal Reserve was created, it would make an incredible movie, which we haven't seen yet.
Yeah, it's not all just dry data, and it's not all just economic facts and all this other stuff. It really is a story. It reads like a story because it is. It's a scandalous story of how they essentially transported the system that they had in England and were using in England to the United States
via the Rothschild dynasty.
Rothschild, Rockefeller, Warburg.
Once you get it down, it's pretty easy to understand. It begins. It's kind of hard not to point a finger at the Rothschilds because they create such a looming dynasty with the takeover of the Bank of England, and then of course spreading out amongst the sons and the brothers amongst Europe, and of course they have to come and take that jewel of America and figure out it. But by then, their techniques of undermining the banking system and the economy of a country has already been formed. So give folks an idea about how the banking system used to work before the Rothschild dynasty got a hold of it. That's what G. Edward explains also. But how it used to work, how it's supposed to work, an example of that, and then show how they make it work.
Well, it was never perfect. We've never had really a 100% money system, and so that's a problem. They've always had fractional reserves. The thing is, though, it used to actually have some backing, and that backing was gold or silver, and so that limited the amount of money that they could create out of nothing, and then, of course, that limits the amount of problems and consequences that stem from being able to create money out of nothing. They just... You know, what's interesting is a lot of people say, and I'm not here arguing that gold or silver are the only two possibilities. Some people are very, very adamant about that being the only possibility. What I'm saying is they are certainly better than the system that we have right now. There may be, you know, through technology, there may be different options that are available. I don't know. But to the people who are so against gold, they say, well, you know, they can manipulate gold, they can manipulate silver, they can, you know, hoard it or do all these other things, and it's true. And then with the fractional reserves, the fractional reserve capability on top of that, it gives them the ability to still cause problems. But what they did by removing gold was gain complete control over all money. That is something they could have never achieved with gold or silver. Now they are the sole source of all money.
And it seems, and money in itself seems like a static thing, and sure, people can sit there and go, well, that's the economy and that's the one that we're working under. But in the words of John D. Rockefeller, competition is a sin. And well, so what they do is, what happens with that economic system is it moves out into our reality, into our society, our culture, our civilization, and they're able to create a atmosphere where competition is eliminated. Independent banks that or independent small businesses that were creating savings were actually at some point able to go out and spend more money and create more jobs for the economy. This system is completely controlled, especially at this point in our history. And so,
well, you know, if you want to control government, let's just break it down to the most basics. Or if you want to control anybody, money is the thing that ultimately determines whether or not an institution or an organization is going to be able to do what it wants to do. Words on paper are not going to control government. Campaign stump speeches aren't going to control government. Promises aren't going to control government or corporations. Promises aren't going to control people who are in the seat of power anywhere. Essentially, you have a couple basic options. One option is force, and the other option is money. So until we can actually control the amount of money that the federal government has access to, it's going to continue implementing the policies of those who control our regulatory system and our governmental system. And these are the elites that, you know, even people who are apologists for globalism admit that these people have disproportionate influence. They use nice euphemisms, but essentially these are the policymakers. These are the people who are determining policies. They're determining our foreign policy. They're determining our domestic policy. They're determining economic policy and monetary policy. All of this stuff affects us, and it just so happens that it affects us in a negative way, and all of the benefits accrue to them. So as long as they remain in charge of this system for confiscating wealth and undoing the current system as it is, or, you know, continually eroding what was there and creating something that they can continue using to their advantage, we have problems. But if we're able to cut off that money, we gain the same power that the people who are creating this money out of thin air have had all of this time. If I could, I'm a big fan of using their own words against them. Mm-hmm. So this is a quote this is a quote that I have in the book from the guy who created our current monetary system. This is from John Maynard Keynes. So I'm sure most of you have heard of Keynesianism. That's the system we're under right now. Here's the quote. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and it does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. Now, that might have been true when Keynes wrote that in, I think, 1919 or 1920. Sure. It isn't true anymore, okay? Now, thanks to the numerous books, Dishonest Money, Financing the Road to Ruin.
Thanks to the internet, which Keynes had no idea was coming.
Right. It is very easy at this point for you to pick up a book on the topic, learn what they're doing, learn how it works against you, the enormous power. Another thing I like to say to people is I say, imagine if today I gave you the exclusive right to create out of thin air money. You have the exclusive right to create what everybody else either has to earn, borrow, or steal. How much power would you have? How much power would Infowars have if today, I mean, to reach the masses with the truth, if Infowars was given the exclusive right to create money out of thin air? What would your reach be? What would
you know what we are able to create out of thin air?
What's that?
Knowledge.
There you go.
Which is a lot stronger than money. And it leads me to a thought that I have, especially when I read G. Edward Griffin in your book, is it's hard to imagine, but I think about my grandparents and my great-grandparents in World War I and World War II and the Vietnam War, the wars we've endured for these people. For these people.
Exactly. It's to erode national sovereignty. I mean, that is their unapologetic goal.
And they had no knowledge of that. You know, it sounds almost un-American to say that, but it's very American to say it because we have to get America back. And if we got America back and we got these people out of power and in control of our currency, can you imagine what kind of world we could live in?
Yeah. Well, that's what we're working on. That's what we feel compelled to do, is to continually expose that, you know, the current system's based on deception, theft, and violence. And when you eliminate their ability to deceive, you erode an enormous amount of their power. Because without the deception, then people are a whole lot less likely to accept the theft and that only leaves them with the last option, which is violence, and you can't conceal violence. And you also need the theft to finance the violence.
Sure.
And you need the consent of the deceived to accept the violence. So, you know, I like to begin with that concept of destroying the deception as a base, and then continually working towards, you know, this has been going on forever.
Forever.
There have been elites, and there have been those who were exploited beneath them. Of course, nobody or a few people want to believe that they're living in a predatory system. We have to show them that they are. Just because it's not necessarily visible, the consequences are there, and you just have to point out to them the cause of those consequences.
Well, it's very reassuring that there are people like you out there that are taking a stand and making a difference. And it's also reassuring that they're getting so desperate and sloppy. With all the stories of their overreach, there's also a huge amount of sloppiness that happens day in, day out here every time you look at the news. So we want to thank you, Joe Plummer, for writing this book. And, of course, you can find Joe Plummer's Dishonest Money, Financing the Road to Ruin at Infowars.com and go under store to find that. And, again, thank you, Joe, for joining us today.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
You too.
All right. If you want to join us here at Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.tv, there's a 15-day free trial going on. If you're seeing this on YouTube, the easiest way to come and check out what we're doing is by doing the 15-day free trial and decide for yourself if what we're doing is conspiracy theory, conspiracy fact, or actual true journalism. There's a 15-day free trial. Just go to PrisonPlanet.tv. And, of course, we're getting more and more submissions for the reporter contest. If you want to join us here at Infowars.com, actually join us right here at Infowars.com. We have the reporter contest going on. It's at Infowars.com/reporter-contest. And, of course, there's 5,000 per reporter prizes, 10,000 in total, 5,000 for a male and 5,000 for a female. And we've had a lot of good entries so far. You have until April 30th, 2012, and we've got the official rules up there and the official guidelines. Just follow those guidelines. They're fairly simple, and we welcome more additions to our staff here at Infowars.com. Well, that's going to do it for me, Jon Bowne, tonight on this Friday, April 13th, Friday the 13th, 2012 edition of the Infowars Nightly News. Have a good night, and keep on fighting. Why we're in the situation we're in and the intricacies involved with the criminal activity that was born of the Federal Reserve. And, of course, you can find this book at the Infowars store. It, again, is Dishonest Money. And now we go to Joseph Plummer. And, Joseph, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, John.
And I just want to start off with a quote here, basically from your Obi-Wan Kenobi. G. Edward Griffin says of Dishonest Money, an excellent job of condensing a large and complicated topic.
Done back in 2003, everything I found was just needlessly convoluted and seemed intentionally vague, and there was a bunch of different conflicting information, and just depending on who you were, you know, whose opinion you were taking, there were just all these different arguments. And it wasn't until a couple years of going through the books written by economists, which is just nothing but economies. If you're familiar with legalese, lawyers, imagine economies. It's the same basic concept. I finally came across The Creature from Jekyll Island a couple years later in 2005. And it was just like...
And that's saying something there, because G. Edward has written this epic book, and each chapter in itself seems to be a book in itself. But you've taken that and condensed it down for people so that it's easier to read, easier for them to understand and recognize within our system the criminality that we're experiencing and have been experiencing for decades.
Yeah, I was pretty happy to get that recommendation because there really isn't anybody else I can think of who I would rather have an endorsement from than Ed Griffin. When I started looking into the Federal Reserve System, oh my God, this is fantastic. This is great. Somebody actually took their time, tried to break it all down, presented only relevant information, pointed out the most important stuff. And at that point, I was really excited because I had a good understanding by then, but I didn't have anything that I could actually give to people. And I was really happy because I was like, okay, anybody can understand this. Well, the thing that I didn't take into account is, yeah, anybody can understand it, but unfortunately, most people aren't too excited about reading a 600-page book. And so that was really upsetting for me.
And welcome back to the Infowars Nightly News. I'm Jon Bowne, your host tonight. We are going to speak with Joe Plummer, who has written a book called Dishonest Money, Financing the Road to Ruin. And what Joe has done for us he's taken the monumental task of taking G. Edward Griffin's The Creature from Jekyll Island and, of course, a lot of other information and breaking it down for the common person to understand